So moving on quickly, we are fortunate to have a member of the administration join us. It is my pleasure to introduce the Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Weapons of Mass Destruction and Counter-Proliferation at the National Security Council at the White House, Dr. Christopher Ford. Dr. Ford has extensive experience in international affairs. He was at the U.S. State Department in 2003 as a Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in what was then the Bureau of Verification and Compliance. In 2006, he was the U.S. Special Representative to the for Nonproliferation, where he headed a U.S. delegation into the 2007-2008 Nonproliferation Treaty Preparatory Committee. And in 2008, he became a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Dr. Ford has served on a number of Senate staffs. He was a national security advisor to Senator Susan Collins. He was a chief investigative counsel for the Government Affairs Committee, and he was a staff of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence after 9/11. Dr. Ford has published a number of books and numerous of articles of a wide range of subjects, including Sino-American relations, nonproliferation, and arms control. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. We very much appreciate it. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ford.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again. Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you all, and a pleasure and an honor to follow Senator Van Hollen, of whom just a few months ago I became a constituent. So he's my senator. So let me start first of all by conveying my apologies that General McMaster's schedule did not permit him to attend today, as well as for the fact that it's going to be hard to talk about some aspects of U.S. nuclear weapons policy by virtue of the fact that the nuclear posture review that was ordered by President Trump on January 27 is still ongoing, as is the ballistic missile defense review. So that's going to take a number of topics off the table at the moment. But as the fellow who runs the Weapons of Mass Destruction and Counterproliferation Directorate at the NSC, and therefore the NSC's point person on issues of arms control and disarmament, I thought I would take the opportunity to touch on an issue that we have only begun recently to speak about publicly as part of this new administration, and that is a topic near and dear to your hearts, of course, of nuclear disarmament itself. In particular, I'd like to talk a little bit about the question of how we can, or whether we can, to what degree can we, at this time of worsening strategic tensions, continued proliferation threats, and the commencement or continuation of nuclear arsenal modernization by every weapons possessor state, how can we think both realistically and constructively about nuclear disarmament? These, of course, are issues of enduring importance to the policy community and in civil society, but different stakeholders will have, and do have, different interpretations of what this troubled time in which we live today means for the disarmament enterprise. Some draw conclusions that follow the well-known words of the prophet Isaiah, to which I assume the Ploughshares Fund's name alludes. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. I think there's also similar language in Micah, if I recall correctly. Such stakeholders in these debates conclude that the growing tensions of the present day mean that it's time to double down on trying to achieve disarmament exactly as the conventional wisdom of the disarmament community has prescribed for so many years. This view treats nuclear weapons primarily as a cause rather than as a symptom of insecurity. Others in this ongoing conversation over the years see just that sort of doubling down as being something akin to the definition of insanity, popularly attributed to Albert Einstein, although also to various other people. I don't really know from whom it comes. Insanity, by this interpretation, is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. The fiercest of these skeptics look not to Isaiah, but rather to the prophet Joel. Beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. There's not a Micah analog to that as far as I know. For such skeptics, disarmament as a dream is in fact just an illusion, and it's time, as they see it, for the world just to admit this and to follow St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians in growing up, putting aside childish things, and getting about the unpleasant and risky but ultimately unavoidable business of living in a permanently nuclearized world. Now, where am I, where are we on this continuum? For my part, I'm not fond of either of those extremes, and I wonder whether we may be able to recalibrate our sources of inspiration in order to discern some kind of middle way, or perhaps some Aristotelian mean, in which it is still possible to speak realistically and constructively about nuclear disarmament, and thus to keep that dream alive. I suspect, however, that this will only be possible if we are able to be more honest about the dynamics that underlie armaments competition and about where our collective disarmament discourse may have gotten somewhat off track in the past. Both communities on those two far ends of the disarmament debate spectrum are, I suspect and hope, in the minority, but they do tend to dominate the debate in their pursuit of an elusive, absolutist moral victory. I think it is time for the silent majority of stakeholders occupying the space between those two camps to bring the discourse back to a practical middle ground, to preserve the gains that we have made on both nonproliferation and disarmament, and the tools and agreements that have been part of that progress. As I see it, US policy on disarmament stands today at a crossroads, because some of the approaches designed in response to the security conditions that existed at the end of the Cold War and into the post-Cold War era, including in particular some of the disarmament-focused elements of the Obama administration's Prague agenda, require some readjustment. For decades, the United States has taken the position that it seeks the eventual elimination of nuclear weapons, even to the point of committing to this as a matter of law in the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, the NPT, committing to this the pursuit of this ultimate goal. While arms control mechanisms of various sorts helped the superpowers manage and reduce some of the risks of their nuclear standoff during the Cold War and limit the upward spiral of the arms race, no actual agreement was possible on reductions in nuclear arms until the easing of tensions in the waning years of the Cold War began to transform the relationship between the United States and its superpower rival. The INF and START treaties constituted the first major reductions in nuclear arsenals as a result of those dynamics. These seminal agreements, as you will all know, were followed by the presidential nuclear initiatives, which dramatically reduced and constrained the category of non-strategic weapons. The optimism that prevailed at the end of the Cold War even led the decision on the part of President George W. Bush in the 2001 Nuclear Posture Review to declare that the United States would no longer, as a matter of policy, insist upon numerical parity with Russia in strategic nuclear terms, although, of course, ironically, this was rescinded by the Obama administration. For some time, in fact, we were actually prepared to unilaterally go well below the numbers that were allowed by START, but, and this is crucial, it was changing conditions that made all of these developments possible and not the other way around. The lesson of this period is that significant arms reductions are only likely to succeed when underlying strategic conditions change in ways that permit them. In light of this, you might think it would be obvious to everyone that the best way, and indeed perhaps the only way, to increase the odds of achieving a peaceful and stable disarmed world would be to create ever more felicitous strategic conditions by focusing upon the very, and I'll quote here, easing of international tension and strengthening of trust between states that the NPT preamble explicitly envisions in order to facilitate disarmament. This point was certainly obvious to US and other Western leaders as far back as November of 1945, long before the NPT and at the very dawn of the nuclear era, when the US, British, and Canadian heads of government jointly declared that the only genuine answer to the problem of disarmament lay in, and I'll quote again, creating conditions of mutual trust. Of course, I don't mean to suggest that there was no debate on this score over the years. From the very start of the nuclear age, as the US representative to the Security Council at the UN observed in October of 1949, disarmament opinions have been divided, on the one hand, between those who emphasize the necessity of developing conditions of confidence before disarmament, and, conversely, those who emphasize disarming in order to engender conditions of world confidence. The United States government has traditionally come down in the former camp, taking what you might call a conditions-based approach to disarmament throughout the Cold War. By contrast, much of the conventional wisdom of the broader disarmament community has often sought to address these challenges from the opposite direction, focusing principally, and in many cases all but exclusively, upon the nuclear weapons themselves, rather than upon the underlying conditions of conflict, competition, and security that continue to require nuclear deterrence or extended deterrence, and, or for other reasons, provide reasons that countries conclude they need to possess such weapons. The broader disarmament community's emphasis upon weapons rather than upon conditions has not changed for a long time. However, in the post-Cold War era, although most US policymakers remained much more sensibly mindful of strategic conditions than most disarmament activists, U.S. officials did feel it important to demonstrate that they were leading the way toward nuclear disarmament, in particular by steadily reducing the number of U.S. and Russian weapons, which indeed looked possible for some time, while security conditions appeared to be improving. President Bill Clinton's 1994 Nuclear Posture Review, NPR, for instance, tried to hedge against uncertainty, as it phrased it, but it also emphasized the importance of leading, again a phrase from the document, leading the international community on disarmament. The objective of demonstrating fidelity to the ideal of disarmament by moving to reduce numbers was given prominence in particular under President Obama, as you will all remember, whose so-called Prague agenda focused upon gradual concrete steps, as it was said, leading toward the gradual elimination of all such weapons, even if this might not occur, as he indeed put it, in his lifetime. Excuse me. U.S. policymakers also argued, and this was stated in the 2010 NPR, for example, and it also appeared in President Obama's 2013 State of the Union address. They also argued that showing disarmament progress by making gradual numerical reductions along a presumed road towards elimination would elicit non-proliferation cooperation from others, while not actually harming U.S. security or the extended deterrence that we provide to allies. But I would posit that much of this approach hasn't worked, and to some degree probably could not have done so, because it focused too much upon the weapons rather than upon the actual conditions under which so many countries still feel the need to have them. Today, the post-Cold War U.S. approach to disarmament seems to have run out of steam. Over time, there was tension that developed within that agenda, as the large number of weapons that were made unnecessary by the end of the Cold War were gradually dismantled, constricting our ability to continue to demonstrate disarmament bona fides by showing continual, relentless numerical reductions. And as the global threat environment evolved from the fairly benign one of the 1990s to the much more problematic and worrisome one today, that also added to these tensions. And as a result of this, it became much harder to continue to move forward on disarmament, at least by numerical metrics, without harm to U.S. national security interests and alliance obligations. The two main elements of the post-Cold War U.S. approach, in other words, seeking to demonstrate disarmament progress while avoiding steps that would undermine U.S. security, began to exist in tension with each other. They began to interfere with each other. And as I've repeatedly noted in public remarks, in recent months, the reduction-centric approach does appear to have been running out of headspace in which to operate. Indeed, to some extent, the very enthusiasms associated with the Prague agenda may have helped make some of these problems worse. And I don't just mean that the heavy political emphasis upon the imperative of total eventual nuclear disarmament created frictions within U.S. alliance relationships, inflamed disarmament-related political fights within allied political systems, and encouraged unrealistic expectations that fueled the Ban Treaty and in turn exacerbated its potential to damage the global nonproliferation regime. All that's true, but there have been also additional externalities with regard to strategic stability. From the perspective of Russian and Chinese planners, U.S. nuclear policy is particularly alarming, not just despite it being part of a numbers-driven disarmament agenda, but in large part precisely because of it. From their perspective, the U.S. disarmament agenda seems less like a salutary moral imperative than a trick with which to put them at the mercy of U.S. conventional military power. They seem, for example, to fear the possibility of some kind of preemptive war in which the United States would employ a combination of strategic nuclear and non-nuclear strikes against Russian and Chinese nuclear forces, destroying enough of those forces that U.S. missile defenses would be able to protect the U.S. from retaliation by what remained. As seen by Moscow and Beijing, therefore, it appears to be largely a question of ratios. The lower their own nuclear numbers, the more alarming the threat would be from any given level of U.S. missile defense and conventional arms. From our American perspective, such Russian and Chinese ideas are just paranoid fantasies. They're fevered speculations about the possibility of us doing what we have no need to do, no intention of doing, and no feasible plan to accomplish in any event. Nevertheless, officials in Moscow and Beijing do appear to give every sign of taking such threats and fears seriously. More importantly, at least in part as a result of such concerns, Russia and China have both been adopting behaviors, developing capabilities or adjusting their own nuclear postures in ways that could have stabilizing consequences as a result of this. I have argued repeatedly, and I think it's an important point of emphasis, that if Russia and China are really worried about these dynamics, then we and they have a shared interest in reining in the North Korean and Iranian missile threats. For these, after all, the primary rationale for the augmented U.S. missile defenses that Moscow and Beijing so dislike. More constructive efforts from them to help us control these threats would go a long way toward alleviating some of the pressures that Russian and Chinese officials say that they face as a result of U.S. responses to those kinds of third-party threats. Now, to the degree that they do not join us in reining in those threats from North Korea and Iran in the missile department, they may continue to face, that is to say, Russia and China, may continue to face what they interpret as an increased strategic threat from the United States as a result of our missile defenses. And this may in turn encourage behaviors in response to those perceived threats that we ourselves do not like. So, in a presumably unanticipated side effect of the disarmament components of the Prague Agenda, the political drive to demonstrate movement toward ever lower numbers of nuclear weapons may have exacerbated these challenges, because that movement threatens to make their, that is to say, Russian and Chinese, offense to defense ratio problems more acute. The effort to show over many years relentless forward numerical progress, I should add, with its concomitant political pressures to eschew anything that is new or different, if you put air quotes around those, in terms of weapons or doctrine. Also, however important those innovations might perhaps be to U.S. national security or strategic stability, may also have harmed long-term U.S. nuclear planning, particularly with regard to achieving and maintaining a responsive nuclear infrastructure capable of allowing us to meet future security needs in an unpredictable environment, and with regard to ensuring appropriate U.S. military prioritization and focus upon nuclear missions. As an example, a task force in 2008 reported that policies adopted in the post-Cold War environment had, in its terms, devalued nuclear missions, causing a serious erosion of focus, expertise, mission readiness, resources, and discipline in the nuclear weapons enterprise in the Air Force. And in 2010, 10 former directors of U.S. national security laboratories wrote to the Obama administration to warn that certain policy restrictions then in place were at risk of stifling those laboratories' ability to react effectively to future security needs. Thankfully, our current program of record for nuclear weapons modernization retains the significant bipartisan support it acquired, in part through a sort of grand bargain between Congress and the Obama administration in connection with ratifying New START. Nevertheless, there clearly have been some challenges over the years as we have struggled with how to retain the focus we still need upon nuclear deterrence, while simultaneously trying to convince onlookers that we are indeed making the relentless numerical progress that they expect to see towards eventual elimination. The Prague expectation that movement toward elimination would elicit support for the U.S. nonproliferation agenda has also not lived up to its billing. To begin with, in contrast to our conventional military might, which they do seem to fear very much, the proliferators and would-be proliferators of the world give scant attention or concern or sign of caring much about our own nuclear arsenal one way or the other. Nor do belated U.S. moves to maintain and modernize our nuclear deterrent appear in the present day to have caused any third-party nation to slow down cooperating with us in the nonproliferation regime. The idea that doing more on disarmament is some kind of a key with which to unlock nonproliferation success is thus a theory still unsupported by evidence. In fact, far from U.S. disarmament postures, having catalyzed an era of phenomenal nonproliferation successes, within the decade and a half after the 1994 Nuclear Posture Review, a time, of course, of sweeping reductions in U.S. and Russian nuclear arsenals, to the point that we now in the U.S. have come down by 87% from our Cold War peak in the 1960s. That period has seen 3 additional countries test and acquire nuclear weapons, and 2 more be discovered in secret nuclear weapons efforts facilitated by a worldwide proliferation network. Now, correlation is not necessarily causation, I'll be the first to admit that, but it is not clear that we got that much by way of nonproliferation success for that 87%. While the causal linkage that disarmament steps build support for nonproliferation is thus at best unproven, the reverse linkage is undeniable. Preventing nuclear proliferation is one of the necessary conditions, although of course not a sufficient one, for nuclear disarmament. Without a strong nonproliferation regime that not only prohibits proliferation but rewards compliance and detects remedies and deters violations, prospects for creating conditions conducive to further arms reductions would be very bleak indeed. Some of the most important nonproliferation progress made during my lifetime, moreover, may in fact may owe more to our nuclear deterrence than to our disarmament. I would agree, for example, with UK Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, who just a few days ago at Chatham House remarked that it was the US provision of security guarantees to allies during the Cold War that made possible the global consensus embodied by the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. So all in all, I'm sorry for the long exegesis, but all in all, it does feel that the evidence is piling up that it is time to recalibrate. The traditional post-Cold War approach of seeking to demonstrate disarmament bona fides by showing steady numerical movement toward elimination, while yet trying to avoid steps that could actually undermine U.S. national security and extended deterrence, has largely run its course and is no longer tenable, especially given the evolving security conditions. So it's time to explore alternatives, and we are. But it may be true that the answer is not something entirely new, but rather a wisdom that has been hiding in plain sight all along, and in a form with which most of the countries of the world have professed agreement for nearly as long as I have been alive. As I noted earlier, the NPT preamble points out the need for the easing of tension, of international tension, and the strengthening of trust between states in order to facilitate disarmament. This, and the causal ordering encoded in that phrasing, that it signals about how to advance disarmament, is the conceptual key to understanding what effective measures relating to nuclear disarmament, and I'm quoting Article 6 of the NPT, we must all work together to pursue. That is, though it is certainly true that the reductions we made in the wake of the Cold War were indeed effective ones in reducing nuclear dangers, as we all now look together to the future, measures that focus upon resolving the international conflicts and rivalries that produce the perceived need for nuclear weapons are much more likely to be effective measures within the meaning of Article 6 than focusing solely upon reducing the number of weapons themselves. If there exists a viable road to disarmament in the current security environment, in other words, it surely must run through the amelioration of such adverse geopolitical conditions. If we can successfully address those conflicts and those rivalries, reducing or even eliminating the weapons themselves may indeed be possible, and if we cannot, it is hard to see how any weapons-focused agenda could succeed, however well-intentioned it might be. Don't get me wrong, there's no guarantee that that sort of an approach will in fact work. The conditions that might make the elimination of nuclear weapons possible are clearly not present in the world today, and it is hard not to agree with the Strategic Posture Review Commission's bipartisan and unanimous conclusion in 2009 that establishing such conditions would likely require a fundamental transformation of the international political order, a transformation that certainly does not seem to be on the horizon at any time soon. But I am convinced that it is still possible to have a vision of the nuclear future that is fully compatible with our obligations under Article 6 of the NPT and with long-standing hopes for eventual nuclear disarmament, and to have a vision that is in reality perhaps more conducive to making real and lasting progress on disarmament than much of the United States' traditional post-Cold War approach. To this end, I would suggest that we need to acknowledge several things. A, how far we are today from the conditions that would actually make elimination possible, and how addressing those underlying conditions really is the rub of the challenge, without which no approach that focuses solely upon arms could possibly succeed. B, how little we really know about the future and the threats that we might face therein. C, the degree to which a full flowering of the world envisioned by Article 6 of the NPT must necessarily await a strategic environment quite different from the one that we face in the world today. And D, the danger that unrealistic expectations about nuclear disarmament, combined with overstated linkages between disarmament and nonproliferation, could put international commitments to nonproliferation themselves at risk. There will, of course, be many, and many of you in the room probably, who will not like hearing that. But such a vision, and I want to stress this, would not give up on the possibility and the long-term goal of disarmament either. Nor would it give up on the hope of negotiating incremental downward steps over time when and to the degree that real-world conditions permit. Indeed, if it could escape the conceptual ruts of the current conventional wisdom and devote itself instead more effectively to addressing the conditions of conflict and insecurity that are the problems inhibiting such progress, such an approach has the potential to end up being a better way to work toward a disarmament facilitating easing of international tension and strengthening of trust between states, in the words of the preamble, than any other path that may be available to us today. After all, Article 6 obliges us to pursue effective measures. It does not oblige us to pursue ineffective ones, so why not pursue new possibilities when what has been tried hitherto does not appear to be working? If other stakeholders agree that such a vision makes as much sense and that it is as honest and as realistic and sounds as promising as I think it does, we will all have much to talk about and work together on achieving as we develop and implement a new agenda of genuinely effective measures designed to help ease those tensions and strengthen that trust in the various sorts of ways the drafters of the NPT envisioned all along. I look forward to your discussion, and thanks again for having me. Sorry? Okay, sure. And here's where I get in trouble.
Hello? Okay. Chris has graciously agreed to take some time to answer a couple questions. Let's see. Where's Daryl? Daryl, where are you? Right there. There you are. Go. We have a...
Good afternoon. Hi, Chris. Daryl Kimball, Arms Control Association. Thank you for your outline about the issues relating to disarmament. I'm sorry to say I disagree with about 95% of it, but we'll save that for some other time. I wanted to come back to something that we might agree on, which is that our common goal, among other things, is to avoid the third use of nuclear weapons. And we've spent a lot of time this morning talking about the North Korea situation. I wanted to come back to that and ask you about the President's strategy in this regard. And before I do, I just want to, we're 55 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and one of the things that sticks in my mind about that crisis and the North Korea crisis is one thing that Kennedy said after the Cuban Missile Crisis. He said, above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to the choice of either a humiliating defeat or nuclear war. So it appears as though the President is trying to execute the policy of maximum pressure and engagement. From the outside, we see a lot of pressure. We see a lot of reckless threats. No engagement, if any. So my question to you is whether, simple one, whether this administration is committed to pursue every diplomatic option available, and whether the Trump administration recognizes or not that North Korea has security concerns that they keep saying need to be addressed if they're going to continue, or if they're going to enter into talks about denuclearization. That's the question.
Great. I will try to provide an answer. One of the reasons, actually, I thought it was particularly fun to follow Senator Van Hollen here is because in his own discussion of the North Korean nuclear challenges, he may not have realized this, but he was actually making what I view as an argument for the very policy that we are currently pursuing. If you envision a continuum of policy responses to the North Korean, or the ongoing nuclear proliferation challenge and missile challenges in North Korea, you can picture that continuum running from everything that the North Koreans want, where we embrace them as a fellow nuclear weapons state in some fashion, all the way to the other end of the continuum, which is a very ugly and kinetic and scary situation. We inherited a posture that was somewhat to your left, to my right, of the center line on here, but with many, or at least a number of levers unpulled and tools untried, well before you get to the ugly end of the spectrum on that side. And we thought it would be unconscionable to ever even try to engage in that binary, horrifying discussion of ultimate alternatives without having tried those additional things. And that's where the strategy of maximum pressure and engagement comes in. There were things that had not yet been done, or not enough been done, that we felt it would be intolerable not to have tried. And we very much hope that they work. The objective is, at the end of the day, a negotiated solution. Our policy remains that of a negotiated denuclearization of the peninsula. It is clearly not something that has been possible with the pressure levers that have been used hitherto, and we felt it necessary to move along that continuum and try things that hadn't been done. The traditional approach, for example, was to look for revenue streams, just as an example, to look for revenue streams that directly contributed to the weapons of mass destruction and missile programs and try to choke those off, and to keep bad technologies, threat technologies, from migrating to there, and of course to keep things from leaving there, going other places. That's an essential piece of this, and we've been working at that very hard for quite a few years. With this administration, we decided it was also possible and necessary to do more. The money being fungible, it was necessary to try to choke off many more streams of revenue, to put the kind of pressure on the North Korean regime, which, if there is a degree of pressure that will do this, would be the way in which they might be persuaded to change, to make a strategic course correction. We've been very clear the objective is not regime change, but what I like to think of as a regime change of mind. They need to make a different strategic choice, which the pressures the international community has managed to put upon them hitherto has not been successful in eliciting from Pyongyang. There's not a guarantee that what we are now doing and the measures that we are taking to amp up that pressure will provide that additional element to turn the corner with them, but we hope dearly that it is. And the objective is to get them eventually to sit down and have the kind of serious discussion that they have hitherto not been willing to have. They need to show us, as I believe many administration officials, including Secretary Tillerson, have said, they need to show us a sign of seriousness about being willing to sit down and have that kind of a conversation. We have not seen that yet. On the contrary, they've emphasized rhetorically and diplomatically, if that's indeed the right term to use when talking about North Korean relations with the outside world, that they are fully committed to moving ahead and that they don't envision any solution that does not involve them fully building out the systems that they intend to present such a threat to us. So our hope is that we can push them across the threshold into having that strategic change of mind conversation finally. We are not yet at that point, as the President has made very clear in public. We hope to get to that point, and the objective is, in fact, the answer, the sort of negotiated answer that the Senator was referring to. And our policy is, in fact, to apply the additional pressures that he was alluding to as well. And we welcome engagement with and support from the Congress in trying to do that, and from international partners. One of the things that messages that we're trying to send very emphatically as well, is to the Chinese. And Beijing has long, the conventional wisdom has it that Beijing has long prized stability and the avoidance of a collapse or some kind of calamitous breakdown on the peninsula more than it has worried about the prospect of a nuclear-armed and ballistic missile-armed North Korea. That may have been true in the past. We hope that it is becoming increasingly clear to the decision makers in Zhongnanhai that preference for stability is now best served by working with us to rein in those threats and to bring about the kind of negotiated solution that I was referring to before. The world does not permit any of us to have the option, and certainly not Beijing, to have the option of a stable nuclear-armed North Korea. The North Koreans have made very clear that their possession of these threat systems is not one that leads to stability, but in fact potentially to very catastrophic and calamitous breakdown. We want the message to be very clear to China that it is their help in preventing that, if they are truly friends to stability and preventing those kinds of catastrophes on the peninsula, that it is jolly well time to work with us, and that it is their help that is essential. And we've been gratified to see that they have been making some movement on this. I don't want to suggest that this is a null set. They have been moving to some degree along this path to applying gradually more pressure. It's not enough yet, but it is a sign of encouragement, and it clearly isn't enough to change the North Koreans' mind yet. Hopefully we can ensure that it ends up being that precisely in order to achieve the objectives that the Senator mentioned. So I regard his argument for a graduated pressure strategy to be, in fact, an argument for the policy that we are precisely pursuing, and I hope that we can all succeed because it is extraordinarily important.
Okay, Michael?
Yeah, Chris, Michael Crepon at Stimson. I'm interested in how you would operationalize your middle path. So I'm guessing that the recapitalization of our triad and various appurtenances is necessary for that security to proceed. Additional reductions, moving incrementally. Do you believe the resumption of nuclear testing is necessary for us to have the security to proceed with our middle path?
How to operationalize that middle path?
Quickly.
Yes, my apologies. That's not as you can probably tell, that's not a strength
Joe
of
was
mine.
telling me, yeah.
Operationalizing it is, first point about that is by virtue of the nature of the task that I'd like to be setting for us, this is not something that is susceptible to sort of enduring litmus test answers, right? If you come up with the list of the 12, 13 practical steps that you think are most important right now, by virtue of the fact that what you're needing to do is respond to the evolving conditions of the world and make those conditions better, the world is not static, and the litmus test answer will differ at different points of time. So rather than offering a recipe that will be sort of our answer to which we think everyone should work, on which everyone should work together, a lot of this will need to be a conversation between the United States, all stakeholders in these issues, and it's not a coincidence that Article 6 refers to each state of the NPT. This is a job for the entire international community. The right answer will be one that we need to work out together on solving the problems that exist between us. Those problems vary from context to context and player to player. So I don't have a magic recipe for this yet, and what I want to do by this reaching out is to begin to engender a conversation through which we can hopefully arrive at better answers together. I don't necessarily mean a solution, but I mean better answers progressively over time, which provide a foundation upon which to build as we continue to move forward. As for testing, I have no reason to quarrel with the assessments of the experts who do these things for a living, that at this time we do not need any resumption of testing. I have my concerns, and we haven't reached a formal policy view on this yet, but I have my concerns about the advisability of forever forswearing that option because I don't know what either the future threat environment or the future technical circumstances will bring. But I see I've heard no evidence to suggest that we need to resume anything of that sort at this time, and I'm very happy that we are able to continue our policy moratorium and encourage others to do so. I would also, in light of our earlier conversation about North Korea, suggest that the most important nuclear testing imperative right now is not to browbeat American officials over CTBT, but to make sure that there are not people in Northeast Asia engaged in actual testing as we speak. So that's an agenda on which we can all work together and will help in some small way create better conditions more conducive to making progress on disarmament in the future. Was that
Okay.
short enough? I'm sorry.
Last question. Please make it quick.
Thank
and
you,
then we
Sharon.
move on.
Squassoni from CSIS. Thanks
Hello,
for
how
being
are you?
here, Chris. Great. So maximum pressure and engagement. I was excited when I heard that was the name of the policy, but now I'm a little confused. I thought engagement was with the North Koreans. So is it maximum pressure then engagement? Can you spin out a little bit for us beyond the Ambassador Joseph Yun channel? What, is there a detailed plans? Do you have, 7, 10 options to engage the North Koreans, or do they simply have to surrender and give up their nuclear weapons before we will engage? Thanks.
The engagement refers to engagement with the North Koreans, which is the ultimate goal. The pressure is necessary in order to make that happen, if indeed it is possible to make that happen. We have, unfortunately, all of us together have a long history of putting pressure on the North Koreans to get them to come to the table, which they promised to do in return, or they promise that they will do only if the pressures are eased in some fashion, whereupon they sit down at the table and therefore having no longer being in a position of facing those pressures, they miraculously end up agreeing to nothing of enormous significance. So the hope is to engage with international partners and stakeholders to make sure that the pressure is sufficient magnitude and appropriately sequenced with engagement, which is not, as I say, it's sort of not yet that point, but our hope is that we get there in order to provide the necessary inducement to produce that regime change of mind to which I referred earlier. So all these elements are a piece of it, but the sequencing is crucial, and we have fallen down on getting that mix right in the past, and our hope is that we can get it right this time, of which there's no guarantee, but we think that if there is a path out of this morass, that is really the only option.
Okay, everyone, please join me in thanking
Thanks
Dr.
again for having me.
for taking the time. Thank you very much.
I should say, this was live streamed, as I understand, but I did get remarks cleared for release, thank goodness, so I have a job tomorrow morning. I have hard copies in case anybody's interested. I'll have them back here someplace. So.